Part 9. It wasn't a natural movement. It was the sound of 1,000 car crashes happening in slow motion. The massive corrugated pillars didn't bend. They reconfigured. The iron roots beneath their feet lurched upward, the amber light within them flashing with a blinding strobe-like intensity. Branches, jagged, rusted arms of steel began to descend from the fog. Again they moved with a jerky, frame-skipping rhythm, echoing the way the severed had moved in the shack. "Movement! Above us!" Sapo roared, his heavy weapon opening up, the tracers carving lines of fire through the frozen air. The iron leaves didn't just fall. They began to swarm, spinning through the air like saw blades. The trunks themselves started to contract and expand, the metal groaning as if the house were drawing a deep, agonizing breath. Cuchillo looked up and saw a massive, three-pronged iron limb descending toward him. The sound wasn't a crash. It was a wet, heavy thud, followed by the shriek of industrial steel screaming in protest. Tortuga had moved with a grace that defied his massive frame, a lifetime of protecting his squad manifesting in one final, desperate sprint. He reached Cuchillo just as the three-pronged limb descended like a god's spear. With a grunt that was more growl than breath, Tortuga shoved the boy clear, his other arm snapping upward to lock his modified ballistic shield into place. The strike was instantaneous. The iron limb didn't hit the shield. It ignored it. The jagged metal spar punched through the reinforced ceramic and steel as if it were parchment. There was a moment of impossible silence, a heartbeat where reality tried to reject what was happening. Then came the red. It was a vibrant, screaming crimson that looked artificial against the rusted gray of the orchard. It sprayed across the iron trunks, painting the corrugated metal in hot, steaming streaks. The limb had driven straight through the shield, through Tortuga's chest, and deep into the permafrost floor. For a few seconds, through a hailstorm of gunfire from Gavilan's sicarios, the fingers stood paralyzed. They watched the limb begin its grinding, mechanical retraction. The metal groaned, pulling back out of the earth with a wet, sucking sound. As it rose, it took the shield with it, and the man who had held it. Tortuga remained pinned to the limb for a second longer, until his lower half dropped, as the iron spar acted as a horrific skewer. As it slowly raised almost mockingly, his upper body finally dropped into the black dirt with a sickening, heavy splash. The shield, his symbol of unshakable protection, vanished upward into the frozen fog, still impaled on the retreating iron branch. "Tortuga!" Cuchillo's scream was high and thin, the sound of a child breaking. The iron trees began to thrash. 6 more unnamed Sicarios men who had survived the foyer and the shack were erased in a whirlwind of razor-sharp tin and slamming steel. Navarro was caught by a swaying trunk that flattened him against a pillar. Pinto and Cruz were snatched by ground-level roots that tightened like nooses, snapping their spines before dragging them into the glowing amber vents in the floor. 3 others were simply gone, swallowed by the shifting of the metal undergrowth. "Don't look back! Keep moving!" Gavilan roared, his voice a jagged rasp. He wasn't looking at the remains of his most loyal friends. He couldn't. The chaos of Tortuga's death had left another vacuum in the unit's center. Panic was a contagion, spreading through the remaining unnamed Sicarios. But in the eye of the storm, the twins were a machine of focus. "Deploying swarms," Ghost and Wraith said in unison. The sound of 12 carbon fiber housings clicking open was nearly lost to the clatter of the iron leaves. 12 sleek black drones, the Wasps, shot upward from the back-mounted canisters, their rotors humming at a high biting pitch. Ghost and Wraith synced them to curved LED screens strapped to their forearms. Each pad was split into a 6-grid mosaic of flickering gray and green thermal feeds. Their eyes darted with a frantic speed, processing 12 different angles of the iron forest almost simultaneously. "Left sector clear for 20 meters, Ghost called out, her thumbs dancing over the micro joysticks. "Wraith, check the canopy. Something is moving in the fog." "Seeing it. Trunks are shifting at 3 o'clock, Wraith replied, her voice flat and steady. "Gavilan, the path is narrow. Follow the green strobes on the ground. We're marking it with the drones." The twins led the retreat through the iron trees, thrashing behind them. Gavilan, Mace, and the others sprinted, their boots clanging against the pulsating roots. The drones buzzed through the iron fog like angry insects. But as they pushed deeper, the wasps began to behave strangely. On Ghost's screen, the thermal feed from Drone 3 began to smear. It wasn't static. It was a visual ripple, as if the air itself were turning into a liquid. "Rico, check the signal," Ghost shouted over the roar of the iron leaves. "I'm getting ghosting on the feed. The forest, it's generating its own interference." Rico fumbled with his handheld scanner, his face pale in the amber light rising from the floor. "It's not blocking us, Ghost. It's taking them. The signal of the drones is being mirrored by the vibrations in the forest. The house is listening to the wasps." As he spoke, the amber light in the roots beneath their feet flared with a sudden, blinding intensity. It began to flicker in perfect synchronization with the new high-pitched whine of the drones freaking out. "Wraith, drones are scrap!" Ghost yelled. On Wraith's forearm screen, one of the 6 tiles went black. The last frame showed an iron branch, not slamming, but unfolding like a hand, to pluck the drone out of the air. "They took them," Wraith whispered, her composure cracking. "They aren't destroying them. They're absorbing them." Through the fog, the hum of the drones began to change. The sound was no longer mechanical. The drones began to emit a low, vibrating groan, the same sound the Viper Thing's voice had made. One of the unnamed sicarios, a man named Paz, looked up as a drone hovered inches from his face. The drone's camera lens didn't look like glass anymore. It looked like a small, wet, amber eye. "Boss, the drone!" Paz stammered, raising his rifle. It's looking at me funny." Before Gavilan could respond, the drone emitted a shriek that shattered the glass in Paz's tactical goggles. He screamed, clutching his face, and in that second of distraction, the iron trees on either side of him lunged. The forest didn't use a limb this time. The corrugated bark of the trees simply opened like a set of vertical lips, and Paz was pulled both ways into the hollow metal trunks. There was the sounds of loud crunch, followed by louder pops, and then silence. "Ghost! Wraith! Ditch the pads! They're useless!" Gavilan yelled as he ran. But Ghost eyes were locked on her screens. 12 tiles, 10 tiles, 8. On the remaining screens, they weren't seeing the forest anymore. She was seeing themselves. The drones were circled above the group, filming the fingers from above. But in the video feed, the soldiers weren't wearing tactical gear. They were wrapped in silver cords, their faces replaced by the flat white masks of the men in the foyer. "We're already there," Ghost whispered, her hands dropping from the controls. "Ghost, look," Wraith said, looking up, still keeping pace with the group. The wasps were no longer drones. Their carbon fiber shells had begun to soften into something resembling chitinous skin, and the rotors now sounded like the buzzing of bloated carrion flies. "There, to the left," an unnamed sicario screamed, pointing toward a sudden rift in the iron trunks. It wasn't a natural gap. The metal pillars had pulled back, revealing a path that glowed with a pale, sterile white light. "Gavilan, look, the opening!" Mace shouted mid-pant. The group made a frantic dash, but the orchard was a precision instrument. As they ran, a massive iron limb, silent as a shadow, swept down and snatched the shouting sicario who first spotted the new opening. He didn't even have time to yell. He was simply vacuumed upward into the dark canopy. As the group reached the threshold of the rift, the air was filled with a high-pitched electronic shriek. The mutated drones descended like a cloud of silver locusts, targeting the group's escape. But just as the group crossed, the high pitch reached a crescendo. The mutated drones descended like a cloud of silver locusts, targeted their first origin point. They swarmed Wraith, their needle-like landing gear sinking into her tactical vest and her neck. "Ghost!" Wraith's voice broke the silence, raw and terrified. The drones fired their mutated thrusters in unison, the amber light in their lenses burning bright as they hauled Wraith upward and away from the group. "Wraith!" Ghost didn't hesitate. She broke formation, turning back into the iron forest, her boots pounding against the pulsating roots as she chased the flickering lights of the drones. Gavilan reached out, his hand grasping at empty air. "Ghost, get back here! The rift is—" But the iron trunks were already sliding back into place. The opening wasn't a mistake. It was a scheduled event. It closed with the finality of a guillotine, a seamless wall of corrugated steel sealing Gavilan, Mace, and the remaining men on one side, and the twins on the other. Ghost sprinted through the fog, her lungs burning with the smell of ammonia. She could hear Wraith's screams getting thinner and more frantic. As Ghost rounded a massive gnarled iron tree, she could see the drones. They were accelerating. And just before she could scream at what she knew was about to happen, with a collective buzzing roar, the swarm slammed Wraith, still clutched in their talons, straight into an iron tree trunk at terminal velocity. Ghost stopped her movement the instant she saw the impact. She didn't move. She couldn't breathe. The sound was a wet, heavy thud, the sound of a fully stuffed sack of thick liquid hitting concrete. Wraith made the briefest sound just before she met the tree. Her body hit the iron with such force that it left a dark, steaming smear across the rusted metal. The drones released their grip, and the crumpled, broken remains of her sister slid down the trunk, landing in a mangled pile in the black dirt. Ghost fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she watched the descent. "A tragic resolution," a voice sighed. Lucho stepped out from behind the blood-smeared tree. He looked down at Wraith's body with a look of clinical interest. She was the left eye, wasn't she? And you, the right. This place finds symmetry so distracting. It prefers the singular. Ghost looked up, her face a mask of tear-streaked fury, but her voice failed her. "Don't be sad, Ghost," Lucho whispered, waving a hand toward the surrounding shadows. "She isn't leaving you. In the idea, nothing is ever truly discarded. It is merely repurposed." From the darkness between the trees, shapes began to emerge. Ghost's blood ran cold. It was the fingers. Viper stepped forward, his body flickering like a corrupted video file, his jaw hanging at an impossible angle. Padre followed, his eyes flat, the silver cord pulsing in his navel, his hands folded in a mock prayer. Tortuga's remains were there, too, or what was left of them. His upper torso was suspended by silver wires, his entrails trailing behind him like a wedding train, his dead eyes staring at nothing. They were all in the shapes they had died in, shredded, punctured, and broken. "They've been waiting for the set to be complete," Lucho said with an endearing smile. On the floor, Wraith's mangled corpse began to stir. It wasn't a human movement. Her spine snapped and rotated 180 degrees with a sound like dry wood breaking. Her head, partially flattened from the impact, lolled backward until it was completely upside down, her chin pointing toward the ceiling. Her limbs began to sprout silver filaments, her arms, legs, and bones sprawling out and inverting. She looked like a giant tactical insect, her joints popping and resetting in the wrong directions. The thing that had been Wraith began to crawl. It moved with that same terrifying frame-skipping speed, its inverted hands, feet, and bones slapping against the frozen dirt as it scurried toward Ghost. "Wraith, please," Ghost whimpered, backing away on her heels. The creature opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was a horrific multi-tonal scream, the sound of the drones, the iron trees, and Wraith's final dying terror, all mashed into a single unending note of agony. As the insectoid horror lunged, Ghost thought she might have saw a flicker of recognition in the creature's eyes. Part 10. The sound of the rift closing was a heavy tectonic thud that vibrated through the marrow of their bones. It wasn't just a door shutting, it was the world being edited. The corrugated metal wall was now seamless, as if the iron orchard and the twins had never existed. The silence that followed was suffocating. "What the fuck? What the fuck, Gavilan?" Mace's voice shattered the quiet like a gunshot. She wasn't barking orders anymore. She was pacing the narrow, frost-covered space, her carbine hanging loosely by its sling, her hands trembling as she clawed at her own tactical vest. Gavilan didn't move. He stood with his back to her, staring at the blank wall where Ghost had disappeared. His shoulders were slumped, his posture devoid of the hawk that had commanded them for 20 years. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't answer. Behind them, Cuchillo was sitting on a rusted crate, staring off into the dark. His eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on something miles away. He didn't blink when Mace shouted. He didn't move when the frost bit into his skin. He was a hollow shell, the edge of the unit finally dulled into nothingness. Sapo and Rico stood with the remaining sicarios, a small huddle of shivering men who looked less like soldiers and more like cattle in a holding pen. Mace stopped her pacing and grabbed Gavilan by the shoulder, spinning him around. The ice on his beard cracked as she forced him to face her. "Look at me!" she screamed, her eyes rimmed with red, a desperate, raw distress breaking through her veteran mask. "Viper is a ghost. Padre is gone. Tortuga was torn in half right in front of us. And now the girls." Gavilan's eyes were vacant. He looked like a man who had seen the sun go out. "Remember the mountains in Guerrero?" Mace's voice dropped to a jagged whisper, a memory bleeding into the freezing air. 10 years ago, we were surrounded, bleeding out in that ditch. You looked me in the eye and you promised. You said, no job is worth our lives, Mace. If the price is the family, we walk. You promised me. We were more than just expendable, Gavilan. She slammed her fist into his chest plate, the sound echoing hollowly in the vault. Where is that man? Because all I see is a dead man leading us to our tomb. We're down to 5, Gavilan. That was our fucking family. Gavilan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The whole of his life, the reality of the trade, was being replaced by the screaming madness of the idea. He wasn't the butcher anymore. He was just a man at the mercy of impossible. He stared at Mace's fist pressed against his chest plate. But as he looked down, the frost clinging to her knuckles began to weep. The biting cold of the industrial vault vanished, replaced in a singular heartbeat by a suffocating, sweltering heat. The air grew thick, instantly heavy with the smell of river silt, rotting wood, and the coppery tang of flesh and smoke. Mace staggered back, her boots slipping. The grating sound of metal beneath their feet was gone. She hadn't moved. Gavilan hadn't moved, but the floor had turned into deep, rain-slicked mud and uneven dark stone. The metal walls of the vault did not slide away. They simply bled outward, expanding into infinity, until they became a bruised and oppressive canopy of bruised purple and sickly yellow clouds. A black light rain fell. The dark drops hit their tactical helmets like bees pollinating flowers. What? Where are we? Sapo gasped, his heavy weapon dropping to his waist as he spun around. They were all standing exactly in the same tight formation, but the world around them was a staggering, ancient nightmare. They were in the heart of a sprawling, labyrinthine metropolis of dark stone and crumbling mud brick. The dwellings pressed in on them, towering and oppressive, their facades worn down by an unseen, devastating passage of time. The architecture was crude but monolithic, a civilization built by the backs of thousands, now decaying into the earth. To their right, a massive churning river cut through the heart of the city. It was choked with waterlogged barges and rotting wooden boats, their ropes frayed, slamming against the stone banks in the turbulent currents. And looming over it all, dominating the ruined skyline, was a colossal tiered ziggurat. Its massive stone steps were cracked and overgrown with sickly black moss, reaching up to pierce the storm clouds. Look at the streets, Rico whispered, dropping to his knees in the mud. The narrow avenues around them were teeming with life, but not the living. Phantoms of a desperate, decaying society surged past the fingers. Crowds of people clad in soaked rags pushed small animal-drawn carts through the muck. The wooden wheels splintered under the weight of ancient wares. Market stalls made of stretched animal skins sagged and collapsed under what appeared to be a torrential rain. The figures didn't acknowledge the cartel men in their modern tactical gear. They were simply an echo of a civilization on the absolute brink of an overwhelming, apocalyptic landscape. A promise is just a thought that hasn't been corrected yet. Lucho was there. He was sitting atop the altar of the ziggurat, swinging his legs like a bored child. The light from the purple-yellow sky cast long, flickering shadows that made his body look elongated and his limbs stretch along the altar. May spun around, her rifle up, but Lucho didn't even flinch. "You're upset because the hand is smaller," Lucho said, his voice a haunting, multitonal hum. "But a hand is only useful if it wants to grab something. You aren't here to take. You're here to be taken." He hopped down from the altar, his boots hitting the floor with a sound like a heartbeat. He walked toward them, his white eyes glowing with a faint internal luminescence. As Gavilan and the remaining fingers stood frozen in the black rain, the sky began to shift. Gavilan and his team's eyes never left the distant altar or Lucho's approach down the massive, moss-choked steps of the ziggurat. Even amidst the sprawling architecture, the rhythmic, heavy sound of his boots on the polished stone was the only sound Gavilan's group could focus on. But as the sky accelerated and the unnatural darkness came crashing down, the faintly glowing eyes of Lucho vanished. The sound of his approaching steps was swallowed by the bruised twilight ripped open, rapidly bleeding into an almost pitch-black night. Through the tearing clouds, a cold blanket of stars and a razor-thin crescent moon stared down at the sprawling ruins. In the distance, beyond the ziggurat, past the massive perimeter walls of the city, rugged, jagged mountains were continuously illuminated by silent, flashing arcs of lightning. With the night came the fires. The ancient metropolis began to glow ominously. Thousands of torches flickered to life in the black rain, giving off only the faintest light. But high atop the grand ziggurat, massive hearth lights and sacrificial pyres roared, casting dancing shadows across the rain-slicked mud brick. The orange firelight reflected in the dark, winding river below, making the water look like a churning artery of blood. Gavilan stood paralyzed in the mud. The cartel boss, the butcher who had carved his legacy in blood and territory, was entirely dwarfed by the sheer scale of this unwanted paradigm shift. Looking up at the roaring pyres of the ziggurat, he realized with a sickening clarity that the violence he had peddled his whole life was nothing but a crude, microscopic imitation of the ancient industrial slaughter that must have built this place. He dropped his gaze to his hands. The tactical rifle he held felt like a hollow, meaningless toy against the weight of antiquity. Mace slowly raised her weapon, sweeping the decaying market stalls, her tactical training fighting a violent, losing war against her sanity. She was desperately searching for a physical threat, an angle, an ambush point, something she could put a bullet in. "Form up on the bank," she screamed, but her voice was thin, crushed by the roar of the darkness and impossible situation. The phantoms of the drowned city surged past her barrel, completely undisturbed. The realization that she couldn't shoot phantoms finally broke her. Her arms trembled and the heavy carbine lowered, pulling her down toward the mud. Cuchillo didn't flinch at the sudden ignition of the city. Sitting on a ruined block of stone, he leaned forward and stared into the churning, bloody river. A slow, vacant smile spread across his face, seemingly snapping whatever remained of his mind. He reached down, plunging his bare hands into the freezing muck, letting the dark silt coat his skin as he began to murmur something in a guttural language no one recognized. Sapo, the mountain of a man who carried the heavy machine gun, dropped hard to his knees. The oppressive heat, mixed with the choking smell of ancient rot and copper, overwhelmed his senses. He tore his tactical helmet and gas mask off, violently dry-heaving into the stone street. His massive frame shook uncontrollably as the crushing gravity of the alien timeline physically pressed the air out of his lungs. Rico frantically slapped the side of his handheld scanner, his thumbs flying across the keys in a desperate bid to find a signal, a familiar frequency, anything real. It's wrong, he stammered, his eyes wide as he stared at a screen rendering impossible telemetry. Gavilan, fires. They aren't giving off heat. And the river. He pointed a shaking armored finger at the dark water. The scanner is reading the river as a singular, massive biological organism. The unnamed sicarios, hardened killers, who had survived cartel wars, ambushes, and military sieges completely unraveled. The transition from the iron vault to this antediluvian nightmare severed their final, fragile threads of discipline. 3 of them dropped their weapons entirely, collapsing onto the rain-slicked stones to weep openly, pressing their hands over their ears in a futile attempt to block out the roaring of the ziggurat's pyres. 2 others broke rank and ran. They sprinted blindly into the phantom crowds, screaming as they vanished into the labyrinth, dark mud-brick dwellings, swallowed by a city that couldn't actually exist. The remaining simply gave up. They huddled together in a tight, shivering circle around Gavilan and the Fingers, pointing their rifles aimlessly in the dark at the shadows. The rain, waiting for the ancient world to serve them the same fate as the phantoms.